Part of prison life means that you're locked up in your cell come lights out, and left alone in your bunk, barring for maybe a cellmate to contemplate the choices that led you here, and maybe try and get some sleep if you can. But what happens if the cell that you're locked up in at night becomes your very own haunted house every time those lights are switched off? Because that's exactly what some inmates of Shrewsbury Prison used to experience, all the way up to its closure in 2013. And even now, while you're on a tour, you can hear the stories of prison guards who would refuse to work the night shifts alone, or kitchen staff who'd find things go missing with no explanation. Or of course, the terrifying encounters of tour groups, just like the ones that you can take every day, who have their own encounters with one of the entities thought to remain in the wings of this old prison. So the prison that we can see today, and the one that most of the members of the public will walk around, isn't actually the original prison. The first iteration of Shrewsbury Prison was opened in 1793 and became known locally as the Danner, which replaced Shrewsbury Castle as the main place in town where you'd lock up your criminals. The jail was given the nickname the Danner after the Reverend Edmund Danner, who lived near to Shrewsbury Castle, which is just on the other side of the railway station to Shrewsbury Prison. Just stand outside the main gates of the prison and you'll see the castle. And there's also a little road, like footpath bit, that runs partway next to the prison, that's called the same name too. And so when the jail was opened in 1793, there were 204 cells designed to house 179 men and 25 women. Eventually though, conditions in this prison became absolutely awful. It was obviously stuffed to the rafters with criminals, totally overcrowded, no sanitation, and instead of being separated by gender or even age, you were imprisoned in a cell with other people who had committed the same crime as you. So all the thieves were in one cell together, all the murderers in another, and so on, whether you were a man, woman or child. And I mean literal child. The age where you could be held criminally responsible back then was 7 years old. But going into the mid-1800s, the entire design of the prison was outdated. It just wasn't working. And so they flattened the building and in 1877 built a new one, pretty much over the top of the old one. And now the only clue that there ever was the 18th century jail is the gatehouse. That's the only above ground bit that's survived. But there are tunnels that are now buried underground, made up of the remaining Georgian prison cells. And another interesting little architectural factoid about the prison is that there is a platform at the train station, so opposite the road, which used to be platform 8, but it is now being walled up out of sight. And the reason for that is because this was the platform that was used to transport prisoners to the prison via the railway, and they used it between 1868 and phased it out sometime in the First World War. But with the prison itself, obviously we're talking about British prisons in the 18th and 19th century right now, not a nice place to find yourself. Just because they'd updated the whole building doesn't mean it's going to be a nice stay. As a prisoner back then, you'd be sentenced to things like hard labour, or of course execution, and there were quite a lot of executions that have taken place here over the prison's life. The first one was a 25-year-old John Smith, who was hanged on the 15th of August 1795. His crime? Well, I'm glad you asked. He stole 10 handkerchiefs from a shop. I know, it does seem very steep, but that's because we had what was known as the Bloody Code, which meant that criminals were sentenced to execution if they were found guilty of any of the over 200 crimes which carried the death penalty. And the reasoning behind this legalised bloodbath was that they were trying to create a deterrent to crime. Like, don't be bad at all, or you'll die. Obviously, don't kill people, don't steal things that aren't yours, don't impersonate a Chelsea pensioner, don't look shifty in a forest, don't do anything. The executions were public, and the logic is there. They want you to see what happens when you commit a crime, the final humiliation that you're hung in front of your friends, family, colleagues, neighbours. But it didn't really work out. It just turned into a great day out for all the family. Thousands of people would line the very narrow street outside the prison to get a good look at the day's entertainment, and they would set up the scaffold where the prisoner would be hung on the flat bit of the gate lodge roof. So it really wasn't the deterrent they were hoping for. On the 9th of April 1868 though, the last public execution took place on the gate lodge, literally a month before public executions were banned. John Mapp had been sentenced to die for murdering 8-year-old Catherine Lewis. He maintained his innocence the whole way through the trial and everything. Until the night before the execution, he confessed to everything. 5,000 people turned up to watch what would most likely be their last execution they'd get to witness, and it wasn't a smooth dispatch. Just at the last moment, John Mapp turned his head, which shifted the position of the noose, so the eyelet whipped round and just sat just under his chin, which meant that his neck didn't break and he didn't die instantly, and he apparently struggled for 30 seconds. After the ban in 1869, they put up a purpose-built shed at the back of the prison, although it was only ever used for 2 executions. And then sometime in the early 20th century, they built what was known as the execution suite, which consisted of the condemned cell cell, as well as a proper execution room and all of that, contained within the prison's D-wing. And I've spoken a little bit about the process of execution, especially after 1868 in the Shepton Mallet episode, because by that time, prisons around the country operated basically the same way. So for a brief rundown, the condemned prisoner would be moved into the condemned cell for the last 10 days of their life. And the condemned cell, it wasn't a bad place, all things considered. It was roomier than the prison cell that you'd been moved from, and you'd have access to things like board games, cards, like that sort of thing. But what you wouldn't know is that the bookshelf in your room had a doorway, which would take you right into the execution room. You'd also be constantly watched by 2 prison officers for the obvious reason that they didn't want you killing yourself and therefore you get away with it before justice can be carried out. But also, they're there to keep your spirits up. Like, yeah, you're gonna die. It's now inevitable. But you don't just have to sit in your cell and be alone with your thoughts about it. They'll give you tobacco, maybe even a bit of alcohol to calm the nerves, and they'll be there to chat if you fancied it. The executioner would arrive the afternoon before and he would size you up, get your height and weight, covertly of course, like you wouldn't know he's been observing you. Doesn't want to freak you out, but this was just so that he could sort out your noose and make sure that you were going to drop at just the right distance, because having a rope that was too short or too long could make for a much messier death. Too short and you'd be strangled, too long, you'd be beheaded. At 8 a.m. on the morning of your scheduled meeting with your maker, the prison officers would move the bookshelf, revealing this room that was hidden to you the entire time, hoist you up by either side of you so you wouldn't be expected to walk there yourself, and help you into the execution room and onto the trapdoor, where the noose would be placed around your neck and the lever pulled, where you'd be instantly and cleanly dispatched, in a process which usually took on average 12 seconds from the time you left the condemned cell to dropping through the trapdoor. In total, 8 people were executed in this room, with the last execution taking place on the 9th of February 1961, and that last man was George Riley. And George's case, it was quite controversial. There was already quite a lot of discomfort around the death penalty in Britain at the time, but George's case did nothing but add to that discontent. He was a 21-year-old trainee butcher, and he'd been found guilty of murdering his neighbour, a woman called Adeline May Smith, on the 8th of October 1960. On that night in question, George had been out drinking with his mates, who dropped him off back home at about 1:30 a.m. I saw one source which said that he'd had 10 pints of beer and 9 whiskies, like he had gone large that night. At 2 a.m, one of Adeline's neighbours heard a piercing scream, but it wasn't until 10 a.m. when her battered body was found in her bedroom. George was picked up by police that day, and by 5 minutes to 7 that evening, after 5 hours of intense questioning by 2 police officers, they had a signed confession out of him, which stated that he'd broken in with the intention to rob her. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. But looking at the details here, like just so many things don't add up. First of all, the confession apparently says that Adeline had disturbed him, so she'd suffered a blow to the head, and that's how she'd died. But she was found in her bedroom? Surely whoever had broken in wouldn't have gone into the room where she was most likely sleeping? I don't know, maybe they did, but in that case, I don't really think it's disturbing the criminal, more like the criminal disturbed the victim. Anyway, it gets worse. George said in his written confession that he'd broken in with the intention to steal Adeline's money, but they later found that nothing was missing. Nothing had been taken from her house, and her purse, which contained less than 4 shillings, which is about 20p, was found untouched in her bedside drawer. So yeah, I guess if her purse was in her drawer, then the thief could have been looking for that. But then there was the blood. People who saw the crime scene went on to describe a bloodbath. This poor woman hadn't just suffered a blow to the head. Apparently, and skip ahead if you're squeamish, it's getting a bit graphic, there were bloodstains on the wall, and you could see a silhouette of a person who must have been the attacker. Kind of like he'd blocked that blood from hitting the wall with his body, if that makes sense. Basically, there was no way with an attack that vicious that the attacker wouldn't have walked away with at least some blood on them. The only blood found on George Riley was his own, found on a towel where he'd cut himself shaving. The point I'm trying to get at here, and the point that stuck in a lot of people's throats about this case, was that there was zero evidence corroborating this signed confession. No fingerprints, no disturbances, nothing. And some people also took issue with the statement itself, saying it was way too well written, too concise, too perfect to be the written confession of a trainee butcher. Not to insult your intelligence, George, but apparently it just read like someone who had seen a lot of confessions over their time. You know, like the police officers in the interrogation with George who may have had a hand in writing it. But all of that just didn't matter. Despite the protests outside of the prison, George Riley was executed on the 9th of February 1961. Apparently at 8 a.m, the exact time that the lever would have been pulled, a white dove flew out from behind the bust of John Howard, the prison reformer whose bust sits on top of the prison's old gate lodge, leading some people to believe that that was a sign of George's innocence. Do you think he did it? There really doesn't seem to be any evidence pointing to the fact that he did it, and even if he did, a signed confession should absolutely have not been enough to send someone to the hangman. But not too long after George's case, execution was abolished in Britain and the execution room was turned into a workshop, hence why it looks a little different from what it would have done at the time time that it was used for its initial purpose. But there were still reminders ready to crop up. In 1972, they decided to build a new building at the back of the prison, which was going to be the new gym. They either pulled down the old execution shed at that point, or it had already been demolished. And while they were digging the foundations of the new building, they came across 10 bodies buried in unmarked graves. These were the bodies of 10 prisoners who had been executed, because if you're executed, your body has to stay within the prison walls. You can't release them to families or anything like that. Well, 9 of the bodies, they don't know who they were at all. They'd obviously decomposed to the point that they were unrecognisable, so they were cremated and the ashes scattered at the crematorium. But the 10th body was that of George Riley. So they actually released his body to the family so that they could bury him properly. And so I was trying to figure out who these other bodies could have been. Obviously there have been a lot more than 10 people executed on the grounds. Why are there only 10 in this particular area? The only conclusion that I can come to is that after public execution was abolished, 10 prisoners were executed in private, 2 in the hanging shed at the back and 8 in the execution suite in D Wing. So I'm guessing these 10 bodies were the ones hung after public execution was abolished. But does that mean that there could be more bodies buried somewhere else on the site? They must be somewhere, all of the people executed publicly, because I'm pretty sure that they also wouldn't have been allowed to be buried anywhere other than the prison. Just something interesting to think about, may help explain some of the activity later. But just because execution has been abolished doesn't mean things were peachy if you were sentenced to a stretch at the Dana, because it actually became notorious for having more suicides than any other UK prison. And it got so bad that there was actually an inquiry in 2004 which found that 43% of all self-inflicted deaths in prisons that year had happened at Shrewsbury, and that all the suicides in that prison in 2004 were on the left-hand side on the ground floor of A Wing. And it was thought that scaffolding across that side of the building, as well as being on the ground floor, had made these cells darker and it had affected the inmates' mental health. There was one story, I don't know if it was the same year or another year, but there were 3 prisoners who'd made a suicide pact and had decided to take their lives one after the other over 3 consecutive nights in cell 19, 20 and 21, again on the ground floor of A Wing on that left-hand side. And if you visit the prison, it does make sense. There are 4 floors to A Wing, so that ground floor really doesn't get as much light as the other ones. And so it's entirely possible that just this very small thing of just losing a little bit of light was negatively affecting inmates to the point where it was just putting their mind in such a dark place that they thought they had no other option. In March of 2013, Shrewsbury Prison was one of the 7 older prisons which were closed as they weren't economical to run anymore. By the time it closed, it had been known as one of the most overcrowded prisons in the country. I think in June 2012, which was just 9 months before it closed, it was the 2nd most overcrowded prison in operation. Shrewsbury Prison was sold off and it is now a museum where you can walk around, get guided tours of the place, do ghost hunts, escape rooms, all of the things. And there was talk that the CEO, Joel Campbell, he wants to rip out the gym building that they built in 1972 and put a boutique hotel there instead. So if you fancied staying overnight in luxury, knowing that the building stands on what used to be the execution shed, the ones where those 2 prisoners were executed and the 10 bodies were found, you may soon be able to do that. Wonder if that fun little bit of trivia will be in the welcome pack in the guest rooms. And it will be really interesting to see if guests who stay in this future hotel report any weird happenings. Because perhaps unsurprisingly, Shrewsbury Prison is allegedly very haunted. Starting where all prisoners started off, and some were even finished off, the Gate Lodge. Those big main 18th century double doors. But it's not just a really well fortified airlock for keeping prisoners in. There were actually rooms upstairs in the Gate Lodge, and this is where the current CEO, Joel Campbell, decided to use as his office when he was first getting the place set up. He'd be sat working in his office, maybe finishing a bit of paperwork for the night, and he'd hear someone belting it up the stairs. They're not the safest of stairs, quite narrow and such like, and so Joel made a point in the general morning meetings afterwards, please be careful on these stairs, don't run up them, you'll get hurt. But still, someone was running up these stairs. Eventually it got to the point where clearly someone on the staff wasn't listening to his warnings, and so the next time he heard someone come running up the stairs, he waited outside his door to try and catch them out. As he heard whoever it was reach the top of the stairs, he yanked open the door to look at who it was, but there was no one there. If you cross straight over from the Gate Lodge and go through the front door of what looks to be the house bit, you'll come into what was the governor's office, and before that the living quarters, from back in the time when the governor would have had his whole family living on site. And in 2017, Holby City was shooting at the prison for 10 days for one of their storylines, and they'd set up their production base in one of these particular rooms. The locations manager had just popped back into this room just to grab something, and rounded the corner to see a woman walking away from him in the corridor towards the front door. Very weird. This woman was dressed in grey Victorian style clothing, so definitely not the usual usual Holby City get-up. But what was really weird was that with every step she was taking, she was sinking further and further into the floor. And that very weird detail is made oh so more interesting when coupled with the fact that right where that woman was walking, there used to be stairs down into the governor's wine cellar. Just because the governor lived in a prison most definitely did not mean he was a prisoner. He was a big important man. Of course he's going to have a wine cellar on the prison for him. But obviously at the time, the locations manager for Holby City would not have known that. So it's a very interesting detail for this story, isn't it? But we don't know who this woman is. Maybe a governor's wife? Maybe staff member serving the governor's family? We don't know. We don't even know if it's the same grey lady who's also seen in A Wing, but is most commonly connected to C Wing. Because again, in C Wing, a woman wearing a grey Victorian-style dress has been seen walking out of cell 203, known as the most haunted cell in the entire prison. She walks along the corridor before just disappearing. And she was seen by prisoners and guards even before the prison shut down. And so it would be a bit weird if she was a governor's wife. The governor's family wouldn't have really had anything to do with the prison itself. They would have been kept completely separate. But is this figure one of the two women who were executed for their crimes here? Was it Sarah Jones, a 27-year-old woman who was hanged on the 11th of August 1803 for killing her baby girl? Or was it Anne Harris, a 50-year-old woman who organised the murder of a key witness in a sheep stealing case to try and keep her son, the sheep thief, Thomas Elson, from being hanged for the crime? But the whole plan failed and Thomas, his mother and the perpetrators of the witness murder all hung for it in August 1828. We just don't know. But it is interesting that this grey lady apparition is seen coming out of the cell in C Wing, as this was the women's wing of the prison up until 1921. After that though, when Shrewsbury Prison became an all-male prison, C Wing housed all of the VPs, the vulnerable prisoners, meaning people who were vulnerable to attack in the general population of A Wing. We're talking the lowest of the low who have committed crimes against children and women, like those sorts of people. Then also informants, grasses, and of course former police and prison officers. But even during this time, C Wing was beginning to get this reputation as being a very haunted place. There was one night when a prison officer was just doing a quick round, making sure that all the inmates were asleep, causing any trouble, and he looked down from where he was at the staircase. So as you go into C Wing, the staircase on your right, he saw what looked like a Georgian street urchin sat on the 4th step, crying their little eyes out. The officer did not have any sympathy for this crying ghost child and was adamant that he was never working a night shift in that wing of the prison again. But those aren't the only stories, because there is one alleged VP who is apparently still serving his sentence. The story goes that there was a prisoner called Larry who was originally housed in cell C210 in the 60s, and he was not well liked amongst the screws, to put it that way. He'd always get into trouble, causing drama amongst the inmates, just being generally difficult. The governor had warned him, like, Larry, you need to toe the line, mate. If you don't, you're gonna leave me no choice. I'm gonna have to put you into A Wing to sort yourself out. Larry was kind of there thinking like, yeah, there's no way you're gonna do that. He was in prison for pushing his partner down the stairs and killing her, so there was no way he'd be safe on A Wing, and so he called their bluff and just carried on. On the outside, Larry had been a butcher, and so his job in prison was actually the same, just in the prison kitchens. One day, Larry went to the kitchens to start his shift, and while he was gone, the prison officers moved all of his stuff out of C Wing and into his new cell in A Wing. When the officers went to Larry in the kitchens and told him that he most definitely was going to be moving, he was quite upset. And so the penny dropped. It was no longer a joke for Larry. And he went back to the kitchens, grabbed one of his butcher knives, and turned it on himself, because he would rather do that than face the general population in A Wing. And now the presence of Larry is felt in cell C210. He apparently came back to his old cell, and it's said that there is sometimes poltergeist activity in this cell, although I couldn't find specifically what, but that also he really doesn't like women. If he takes a shine to you, he'll leave you alone, but if he really doesn't like you, you'll feel icy hands around your throat. But he also allegedly appears in the kitchens too. Kitchen staff will report a very menacing feeling in there, and they've reported things being moved about, like tables and chairs, even teaspoons and things like that. And these kitchens are just off A Wing, which is by far the biggest wing in the prison. Of course, coming with their own ghost stories. And it's not unusual if you're walking in there to feel like there are hundreds of eyes watching you from every floor above you. But there is one particular entity who is keeping a very watchful eye. He's known only as Shadow Man, because he appears as a shadow figure. But we may have a good idea who this is. We don't have a name, something about information falling under data protection. Like his family are still living and they're very local to the prison, hence the name isn't out there. But apparently in the last 100 years, sometime in that time period, there was a prison officer looking after the Wands, which is the ground level cells on A Wing, for a night shift. And so it's a night shift, all the inmates should be quiet, staying out of trouble. You only need one officer on each landing. So this officer, he decides sometime in the night that he fancies a smoke. He's a big smoker. So he heads out the fire escape door at the end of the wing to go outside for a cigarette. But while he's out there, he drops down dead from a heart attack. But because it's a quiet night, none of the the other officers have reason to leave the A-wing, so this particular guy isn't found until shift change the next morning. And so now it's apparently him who is seen as a shadowy figure marching on the landings with an energy of being very large and in charge. The shadowy apparition has apparently been seen leaning over the landings above, watching you as you're walking below. It's also been seen walking along the end of the corridors of the threes. So that's like the third landing. It's basically like the second floor or third floor for you Americans, and into cell 43. No idea why. But he does seem to be very much keeping an eye on the place still. One time, it was November 2022, and it was proper stormy, autumn night, the rain was driving down, wind was going, and there was a ghost tour going on. They'd just got into A-Wing and the guide was telling the story of Shadow Man, when the fire door, just because of the wind, just kept opening and closing, like that's how windy it was. So the tour guide went to go and secure the door, either shut it properly or something, and just as she was turning back round to rejoin the group, they all shouted at her to stop. Stop? What? What do you mean? They said don't move. There is a huge shadow figure directly behind you. That gives me literal chills to tell you about, never mind actually being the one that the figure appeared behind. Could you even imagine? Forget that. No thank you, Mr. Boss. Your shift is over. You don't need to appear behind me. Thank you. But it appears like to him, he's just doing his job, as he has been known to follow people all the way around the prison, and you'll know he's following you as you'll get the smell of stale tobacco every now and then. So while those are the main sort of characters known throughout the prison, there is so much activity constantly all over the site. The drop room and of course the execution room, they can be particularly active areas for paranormal investigators, but cell doors slamming, disembodied crying, growling, conversations can be heard, all of this going on. So you can see why it's a firm favourite with paranormal teams and even TV shows. Obviously Most Haunted have been there, Paranormal Lockdown as well with Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman, and even me a little later on in this video. That's right, it's another collaboration, this time with Exploring the Entity. So obviously I'll give you my conclusions after the investigation, but before that, tell me your thoughts. Haunted or just a reputation for human misery, so it makes sense that there's so many ghost stories? I think obviously there is a reputation going into it. So many people died here, whether from executions, natural causes like the prison officer, or even self-inflicted deaths. There's a lot here. But then I do think that there is something to it as well. And I'm not just saying that because of the stories. Although I was already going into it thinking that it was most likely going to be haunted. But it's because I've actually been smart about this one and not recorded the story until after I've been on the investigation. So I've already done the investigation and I don't have to stay up until ridiculous hours recording my post-investigation thoughts. Finally, some common sense. She figures it out. So first of all, thank you so much, Carl, Nathan and Lucy at Exploring the Entity for inviting me along, and to Afterlife and Spooky Events for having us. It was so great to meet you all. And as for the investigation, again, similar to Dudley Castle and Strally Hall, there were interesting moments. There was a very weird moment captured in A-Wing, which I'm not going to say is paranormal outright, because there were a lot of people about in the prison that night. There may have been someone with a creepy sounding gadget or something. We're never going to know for sure unless you hire out the entire prison and you're the only team in the place, really. But it was still a really interesting night. Definitely go and watch that video from Exploring the Entity. I'll leave a link in the description for it, even if I did get absolutely terrified in C-Wing. Look, alright, I'm a researcher. I look into the history and the hauntings. I am definitely not a paranormal investigator. I'm too scared of shadows to do that job properly. But I am a sucker for a good haunted prison. I absolutely love the stories like Shepton Mallet and the National Justice Museum, places like that. And so it was absolutely brilliant to spend time in Shrewsbury Prison and just soak it all in. I still cannot wrap my head around the fact that there were prisoners there in 2013. It's just wild to me. That was not that long ago. And they'd be there sitting in a cell where hundreds of inmates would have spent a lot of their time over the centuries. It's just mad. So bottom line, I didn't see a ghost or experience anything that made me say hands down 100% that place is haunted, but it was very creepy and very dark, and we caught a few interesting bits and bobs, even starting as soon as we sat down to do my little interview bit at the start. So yes, very cool. Highly recommend going and visiting if you're in the area or doing a ghost hunt there if that's your kind of thing. So let me know your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this video, please let me know by just leaving one of those little likes, just that little button below the video. And if you've not already, do hit the subscribe button to hear more of these stories coming at you every week. And so that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. George Riley was executed on the 9th of February 16. Keep saying 1691, it's 1961. There's a lot of difference between those two dates. George Riley would have been executed for looking into Adeline's windows a bit funny if it was 1691.